Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Switch Statement Podcast. It's a podcast for investigations into miscellaneous tech topics.
This is episode 6 in our series on the design of everyday things by Don Norman.
Hey, John. How's it going?
Hello, Matt. I'm doing really well. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I'm curious, do you have a little map in your house which shows you where to turn your lights on and off?
I love that this is the first thing you're bringing up because my apartment is insane with light switches. Like, he showed that image of the bank of 9 switches or whatever, and I think I have a bank of 9 switches. Like,
no.
It might be even
you
worse.
Have 9 switches in your house?
Well, I first of all, I have like 100 switches in my house, but there's one individual bank that I think has like 8 separate switches on it, and it is the worst designed thing I've ever seen.
Never invite Don Norman to your home. He's just gonna have a panic attack, right?
Is this guy like the worst to hang out with? Like, is he just constantly he's just complaining about doors and like light switches at your house?
He walks in and he just starts every interaction listing all of the poorly designed items in his general vicinity. He's
just like, you know, what's the deal with this door handle? Like,
bad mapping, needs a Sigma fire, or anti-affordance.
Dude, one of the things that I thought was awesome about this chapter is it was one of the first times that he showed a concrete like solution, because he does a lot of talking about problems and he'll talk about solutions in the abstract, but in this chapter he actually showed that light switch thing that was like the design of his house, and literally on top of each room was like a switch.
Yeah.
And I was curious, what did you think of that solution?
He acknowledges that it's completely impractical as a solution, because he needed to hire some special technician in order to create it. I think it's probably effective. I think you probably have a good idea of which light you're turning on and off. Yeah. It also strikes me as unnecessary, because if you're like, you shouldn't be optimizing for initial use in your home.
Yeah.
Like,
it's, I mean, because I have this exact problem, so I'm, you know, occasionally trying to think of solutions. I really like the kind of phone-based solution where you just have like an app on your phone and you can like click on rooms or something. Yeah. But yeah, having a huge panel in my house with like a floor plan of my apartment, I should say. I don't have a house. But yeah, like a huge floor plan of my apartment with like switches and rooms, that just seems completely impractical.
So to describe what this chapter is, so this is chapter 4 of Design of Everyday Things, and it's called Knowing What to Do, Constraints, Discoverability, and Feedback. Yeah, and he gets into a lot more. I think the main thrust is that constraints thing. He talks a lot about how are users like, if you take the totality of the design and the culture that the user is in, how are they constrained in what they can do? And he starts with this motorcycle example, and he says, because of the design of this motorcycle, everyone I give it to is able to assemble it without any. They're not even told that it's a motorcycle. It's this Lego motorcycle, and that was. And he kind of goes in. What is it? He says there's
like the 4 constraints.
4 constraints. Yeah.
Yeah.
So physical, cultural, semantic, and logical, and by using those different set of constraints. At least in this little toy example, or all of the participants are able to just figure out, because it's like, oh, well, there's literally only one slot where this windshield can fit. So I guess it's got to go there.
Yeah. No, I don't know. We can go into each of those 4 just a little bit. So yeah, the 4 constraints: physical, cultural, semantic, logical. Physical, he discussed a couple examples. So physical is just literally like, you have a physical object and it can like only fit in a certain way with like the other objects. And an example he gives is like a battery. Like you have to put the battery into the slot in the correct direction, otherwise it won't work. Another example is old USB cables. Like we have USB-C now, but old USB cables were sort of famous for you'd always put them in the wrong way. And he mentions a few interesting things in that section. Like he talks about how inelegant design can persist over the long period, which he refers to as a legacy problem. And I thought that section was really interesting because I've noticed this. He gives a couple examples later in the chapter, like elevators, which maybe we'll discuss a little bit later. But anyway, just to keep going with the 4 types of constraints, he also talks about cultural, which is basically depending on where you're from or how you were brought up, like you kind of have a script that's programmed into your brain for how to handle certain situations.
Right, or it's like you're in a particular environment. Certain options are not even occurring to you as being possible because you're so kind of inculcated in the culture. And so it's like, one example he gives is facing the corner in an elevator. It's like, nothing about the design of the elevator is constraining you as not doing that. But there's just this cultural thing that says only weirdos face into the corner when you're in an elevator.
Yeah. And this is actually something I think about a lot. Like I'm a super introspective person, almost I would say to a fault. And I do think that a lot of, my social anxieties, which, to be clear, I'm not like a super socially anxious person, but I do have some social anxieties or like neuroses. I think a lot of those are attributed to me just kind of not properly learning the script in some cases. Like or other situations, I, struggle to like, follow along with the script because of some reason. Like, for example, if I'm at a bar, it's really hard for me to like hear people because I think my hearing just works in a certain way where if there's like loud music playing, that's all I can hear. And so I just literally can't hear people at a bar. And so I think it's, it's just tough for me to kind of like fit within that frame because I just can't hear people. I thought that section was interesting because he talks about that like concept of a script that people sort of have encoded into them. And it's like, if you don't have that script, you kind of feel awkward in these situations.
I feel like sometimes when you're in a video game, you're presented with 3 or 4 things that you can possibly do. And you're like, what? I can do anything. Why are these only my 4 options? But then you think back and you're like, well, actually, that's kind of how it works in your real life too. Stab this person isn't going to be one of the options. You know what I mean? Yeah. So it's like you're pretty constrained in your day-to-day life anyway. So it's actually not that far off. Playing this game, Heavy Rain, I don't know if you've played it before. It's full of essentially quick time events and there's only a couple of options you can say at any point. But anyway, that just came to mind when we were talking about constraints because even though as long as we think we're just this completely free person that can do an infinite number of things, like actually we're pretty constrained.
Yeah, I do think this is an interesting topic. Like this whole cultural constraints thing just fascinates me. Like this is something he touches on in this book a lot. But you think about like different times, like for example, the Wild West or something, where pulling your gun out and shooting someone like was part of the
cultural norm.
Yeah. So people just behaved a certain way because of that. And today we live within all of these like cushy kind of societal boundaries. Like the threat of physical violence is practically non-existent. But what that means is you can do a lot more with kind of verbal. Like you can kind of push the boundaries a little bit with like the way you interact with people verbally, because you're kind of operating with this knowledge that like, okay, they can't just straight up attack me, which I find really interesting.
All right, well, let's keep on moving on. Then we've got semantic constraints, which it's kind of one of the ones that's a little bit harder to pin down.
Yeah. So I even wrote, I just wanted to say out loud that, semantics is the study of meaning. This is something that I forget sometimes. But to me, this struck me as similar to the knowledge in the head, knowledge of the world thing, where it's kind of just somewhat of like arbitrary rules that are attached to, maybe signifiers. Like he gives an example of red lights, where to us, a red light on the back of a car means that the car is braking. And it's sort of like, as you're driving on the road, you're seeing you're constrained by the car in front of you braking. And it's kind of, that is the meaning that is attached to that signal.
It is interesting because this feels like you could lump this under cultural constraints, because a red light meaning stop.
Yeah. Maybe that's a bad example. I mean, that is the example that he gave.
Another example he does mention is that, the rider is riding on the motorcycle and the rider is facing forward. So from that arrangement, like, it would just make sense that the windshield should be in front of the rider. But
yeah,
it almost feels like this could be subsumed by all of the other ones. It's like, well, it's like, oh, you use the semantics of one of the things you found in the other categories to like decide what to do. So I almost suspect that this doesn't exist.
Yeah, this is actually a criticism that I wanted to kind of level against Don Norman is he will mention these things, but he doesn't give like a clear example where he'll just kind of like roundabout discuss a topic. And I wish he just had straight up, semantic constraint and then just give a very clear example of a semantic constraint.
I mean, he's giving an example. I just don't know if it's a very good example.
Well, exactly. Yeah. The examples he gives are insufficient in my opinion. But anyway, we can move on. Logical constraints. So this goes back to the light switch thing, where a logical constraint might be, if you have two lights in a room and two switches, the position of the switches should correspond with the position of the lights in some way. Another word he's used for this in other chapters is mapping.
Right. And then another example he gives is when these people were building the motorcycle, there's kind of one thing that they may not have had a cultural understanding of. There's this little blue light on the motorcycle. It's not necessarily obvious from the way the motorcycle is being used where it should go, but then they build the rest of the motorcycle, and then there's literally only one place where this final light can go. And so just kind of by reduction, it's got to go there. So, and I guess this is maybe like pure logic where it's just a function of the system. They don't need to rely on anything that they know from culture or what have you, aside from maybe that you're expected to use all of the pieces. So those are the four, and I guess I wanted to ask you again. I like to always bring this back to software engineering and user interface design. Like one interesting question I have is like, how do you represent constraint that's in your digital world, like in a game or what have you, but not necessarily in the physical world? So my one example is you're dragging the Angry Bird back in the game, and there is a limit to how far you can drag it back, but your phone screen isn't going to reinforce that constraint. So I think that's kind of an interesting problem, like because you don't have you can't add a actual physical constraint. There's not a way to like actually restrict the person's finger from moving back. But do you allow them to keep on stretching it and the bird will continue to stretch indefinitely but less, or is it just a hard limit? I don't know. It's kind of an interesting.
And I do feel like video games is such an interesting realm to think about these things. Like you alluded to cultural constraints in video games where like if you take someone who's never played a video game and you show them a modern game, they will have no idea what's going on.
Oh, yeah.
They'll have no idea what operations they can do or why they can't do certain things, or like, you know, whatever. They might just jump off cliffs or something because they don't know that it's going to hurt you. But if you are a gamer, like if you've sort of played games from the past and you've sort of grown up with games, you have this immediate intuitive understanding of like everything you can do in a video game. And I think that's an interesting case of cultural constraints where you've just kind of learned all of these random, you know, rules that video games have to obey.
It is so funny because I was just playing a game and I got a phone call. I turned the sound off, and then you could just kind of tell hadn't completely like figured out where I was, but then I was looking and I was like, oh, this looks like it's the start of a boss battle. And it's just the kind of thing where you can tell based on how the room is shaped and
yes,
the context, there's some, you can see the subtitles, like, oh, someone's monologue, like, okay, this is the beginning of this kind of boss sequence. And it is funny because totally. I feel like people who have, like, to your point, people who have not grown up playing video games, they wouldn't even really necessarily know what a boss means.
Yeah, they'll miss all of those signals because, they just haven't been trained to, like, react to those. Another thing that I wanted to discuss with this is I think these rules also apply to software itself, like, writing code. And, a couple examples are, I think a lot about API design. And so, like, for example, at my work, we have an API that we're developing. And to me, the API has too many functions, basically. Mm-hmm. It's one of the flaws with the API. I think every API has flaws. I've never seen a perfect API in my life, but I think one of the issues with too many functions is you have functions that kind of look like they might do a similar thing.
Right.
So as a user of the API, you're kind of like, oh, which one of these should I use? And it's almost better to have one function that's a little bit more powerful, like a little bit more flexible, than it is to have multiple functions that have like functional overlap. Although that can also be bad because you don't want to have like one function that's ultra flexible. That's an even worse sort of design smell. So you kind of have to walk this line of like, providing the minimal set of functions that get the job done, as little overlap as possible, as clear to the client as possible. And I think, what you're trying to do is have these almost like physical constraints. Like it's like Lego blocks. You want to create a user. There's a create user function. That's clearly the Lego block that you need to use. And you're trying to create a world where it's as clear to the client as possible what they need to do.
One question I always have with API design is how strict should you be? Like, in terms of constraints on your input. I'll give you an example that I just ran into. So this is going to be a little bit specific to Flutter, but so Flutter, it's a UI, mobile UI framework where it's just a desktop UI rendering library essentially. So there's some widget that they have that are literally called widgets that allow you to switch between one page and another. That's all you need to know.
Page view.
There's a page view, right? And you give it a list of items, and then it just pages in between those items, right?
Yeah.
So page view has an API where you can animate to another page. And the other day I was like, okay, I want to animate to another page, but I don't want it to take any time at all. It should be an instantaneous operation. So I call animate to and I say, okay, duration 0. You have to provide it a duration. You also have to provide it an animation curve to explain how it should be getting from place to place, which I was like, all right, that's a little weird. Like, it's not going to take any time, so the curve is meaningless.
Yeah.
So then I run the program and it fails because they're like, you need to provide a duration that has a non-zero value.
Oh.
And that's a case where I kind of feel like, that API, that's a well-defined, like that's a well-defined request. I want you to get to this other page, and I want it to take 0 time.
Yeah.
But apparently the API designer was like, no, you need to provide a duration that has a value. If you want to immediately go to another page, use jump to. And it's like,
oh,
that is a case where I guess there's a couple ways to look at it, but it's an interesting case where they're putting constraints on the way you're using it.
Right.
I guess I would kind of feel like if the user supplies a 0 duration, just call jump to under the hood. Like what? I guess it's unclear to me why I should need to, like, let's say for example, here's a perfect example of why that would be useful. Let's say we want to give the user the ability to control how long animations take. They prefer reduced motion.
Yeah.
We want to allow them to set it to 0. There's no animation at all. It doesn't take any time. Why do I have to check on the duration and then now call something else if my duration is set to 0? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. No, I mean, I feel like this is why API design is so hard. Because to me, immediately, it doesn't seem like there should be 2 functions to perform that action. Like, to me, there should be 1 function per action, and the action that you're taking is you're switching pages. Whether that takes 0 time or some time is it's still the same action.
Right.
So that would be my immediate gut instinct, but I'm sure that there's some, the Flutter designers probably ran into some issue with that. They probably have a 30-page design document about this.
Probably, but it's an interesting question of, is this well defined? Like, it's just a conversation I've had with other engineers before. You run into the situation where you're like, I don't know why a user would ever want to do this.
Yeah.
But we kind of have a clear understanding of what should happen if a user ever did it. Should we allow that option or should we deny that option? I don't think there's a clear right answer.
Yeah, no, I agree, because another thing that I think is super important with APIs is to reject input that your API deems invalid. And invalid is a completely subjective thing. I mean, we discussed this, I think, in our last podcast where we talked about like accepting date formats.
Right.
You might have an API that has like an extremely strict, you need to provide your date in year, month, day, and the API just rejects it otherwise. And there's actually there's a lot of reasons why you would want to design an API that way. Like maybe you have an entire API where every endpoint, takes dates, and you just want to have a very consistent way of supplying dates. You want a date format that's completely unambiguous. You want to simplify, building your service. So there's a lot of reasons why you might want to deem some input invalid that might otherwise be, subjectively seen as valid. So it's just really tough. I mean, this is why, to me, API design is one of the hardest things that we do as engineers, because we kind of need to predict the future, and also just understand all these things that are just incredibly subjective.
This goes back to the whole problem where it's these interfaces is where there's so much room for error. He talks about the idea of interlocks, where one example he has is where the microwave, right? When you open the microwave, it forces the power to turn off because it's like there's a requirement for this operation, and now you violated the requirement, so this other thing has to happen. And I feel like that's a whole nother question in software development, like prerequisites and all this other stuff.
State machines. He also has that long section where he's discussing like faucet design, and he discusses like he literally has a bullet pointed list of like 7 different ways that you can design a faucet, which, on the face of it, it seems like a faucet is such a simplistic thing. Like it just, water comes out of it, there's knobs, whatever. But no, there's like a lot of different considerations that you might have when you're designing a faucet. So I think, one big takeaway is just that design is very hard.
That is definitely true. Yeah, the last thing I want to say, and this kind of dovetails with your point about the faucet, is it just feels like the book Don Norman is writing or wanted to write is a series of design case studies where he really goes in depth about one thing at a time, and he's able to explore it from every single angle. But it feels like he's kind of shoehorning this actually fairly deep analysis of a particular design into a chapter, and like looking at it from aspects that don't really map back to the outer design or the outer point of the chapter. So it just feels like a better way to structure this book would have been to organize it around these examples.
Yeah. He's a very like anecdotal writer where like his chapters always contain, all of these really cool details. Like I feel like I would have, or I might read a book that just had like, like elevator behavior, like a whole chapter on elevator behavior, like whether you're inputting the floor outside the elevator or inside the elevator. Like I would read that chapter. That's actually something that interests me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it seems like what he did is he took that type of material and tried to put it into a book that had a little bit broader appeal, like had broader applicability maybe. I think it's a cool book, but it does make the chapters a little bit confusing sometimes.
Right. I think that's kind of what I'm getting at. But yeah, I mean, I think, so just to call out, so we're splitting this chapter into two parts again. So I think for this episode, we were just talking about the constraints. He goes into a bunch of points about sound, designing the sound of products, and we will. I think we'll cover that in the next one. John, did you have anything else you wanted to talk about?
No, looking forward to talking about sound.
All right. Well, I will see you next time, John.
See you next time, Matt.